Welcome to Your Path to Nonprofit Leadership, the weekly podcast that features the very best in career development in the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Pat McDowell, and in addition to podcasting, I'm a leadership coach, a mastermind facilitator, a best-selling author, and a speaker. I love taking these nonprofit leadership topics on the road or into your Zoom room. If you need someone for your next conference or workshop, check out my new speaking page at patmcdowell.com for more information. Well, I know you're going to enjoy this fantastic conversation I had with Liz Brigham, who leads the J. Hurt Hub for Innovation and Entrepreneurship at Davidson College. And talk about energy and ideas. You're going to come away with a lot more of both of them after you finish listening to Liz. As you might imagine, as the director of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the Hub, she's surrounded by creative and dynamic thinkers every day. But she also brings her own impressive career journey to these conversations. And the end result is you're going to come away with ideas that you can absolutely take back to your nonprofit. And yes, you need to add innovation and entrepreneurship to your leadership toolkit. And Liz will give you specific takeaways as to how you can do just that. She unpacks these specific areas including entrepreneurship and innovation, but also design thinking. And she talks about what they are and how you can literally implement them into your staff team, your board team, and your organization as a whole. You will definitely improve your toolkit as a result of this conversation, and your organization will benefit when you add these special ingredients to the mix. Lots of reasons to check out the show notes for this episode. It's number 184. Just go to the new podcast page at patmcdowell.com and you'll find out all about the resources Liz and I discuss and more about the great work she's doing at the J. Hurt Hub at Davidson College. Without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Liz Brigham. Liz, thank you for joining me on the path.
I'm so great to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Well, Liz, I'm excited about this conversation. You had a wonderful leadership journey in your own right. And of course, you're doing fascinating work for the J. Hurt Hub there at Davidson College. And I want to talk about that, especially because so much of what you do is directly applicable to nonprofit leadership. Of course, you work in all sectors, for-profit, entrepreneurial, as well as nonprofit. But let's talk about one of the headlines that you raised so effectively. Why is team development so important to a nonprofit leader?
Well, thank you so much for the question and the opportunity to be with all of your listeners here today. One thing that really stood out for me recently, I was listening to one of Brene Brown's podcasts, and she interviewed a musician, Cam Franklin, and Cam was talking all about the concept of a band and being a musician in a band. And she said something that the team is the secret sauce. And I loved it so much that it's on a whiteboard in the midst of the J. Hurt Hub here. I have a few different, quote boards and other things to inspire folks around the room. But for me, the team is the secret sauce. I have been very fortunate, as I know we'll get into in a minute, to work with some pretty phenomenal teams, even going back to, college days. And that the idea of the special blend of superpowers, or if you're a chef, the special blend of spices and other things. And, if you think about if everything is just one note, or everybody has the same skill set or is coming from the same background, you really don't get that creativity, the spice, that sort of natural way that people build off of each other. And I do think, I have been an athlete my entire life as well. And to think about that, really embracing that sort of growth mindset, that even though we may come from all these different perspectives and backgrounds and have our own sort of superpowers, we can always get better every day. And so that investment in thinking about what is that 1%, or what are those new habits that we can get into, or how can we really take an intentional pause and look back and say, that what got us here is good, but what's going to get us to the next level, we really need to work at. So really try to embrace that sort of, I say, becoming a professional athlete, in a different use of that term. Really invest in in those ways to rethink, to be self-aware, not only as an individual leader, but also awareness, as an entire team unit, and to set those goals and consistently use, data and anecdotes to think about how do we push the envelope and get better every day.
Liz, you just reinforced all the reasons I'm excited to talk to you in terms of the sweet spot of this podcast, growth mindset. Carol Dweck's book, Mindset, in fact, is one of my favorites. So I'm delighted you lift up that term in particular, because you're right. I think nonprofit leaders, the best ones, have that growth mindset, and they're sensitive to what you just described, the ingredients that make a team come together. Frankly, a lot of them, I think, struggle with, they're filling out an org chart, but maybe not thinking, as you know, about these team dynamics. And of course, before we unpack that, and you've got some great advice to offer, I know, but let's talk about your journey. How did you get into the role you're in now? And I guess, how did your previous experience influence the work you're doing as well?
Sure. Yeah, on the surface, I've been a Davidson groupie for at least 22 years. So admittedly, being able to come back to a place that I love and that gave me so much, and to which I feel so indebted to even repay a modicum of what Davidson gave me. It's wonderful to be in this space, but I'll kind of back into that. So, I graduated from Davidson in 2004 with an English major, but what I did on campus, I booked concerts all 4 years. And so produced concerts. I always like to say I created these spots of joyful time for otherwise very stressed out students and faculty members and staff and community members. But what that gave me was an interesting sort of corollary or balance to my liberal arts education, was the opportunity to create something from scratch. So that entrepreneurial spirit was really emblazoned, I guess, on my Davidson experience, so to speak. And negotiating contracts. I'll tell a short story. I remember the first show I ever did was Counting Crows, and I was on a road trip with my very best friend from St. Louis to Phoenix. And this was summer of 2001. And I negotiated a contract from a payphone in a hostel in Taos, New Mexico.
Wow.
With a middle agent out of Nashville. We ended up, winning the deal with Counting Crows. But nonetheless, it was those little sparks of time that eventually led me to, pursuing my MBA at the University of Michigan. And when I was there, it was 2007 to 2009, Apple came to campus and said, hey, we just launched this thing called the iPhone. We're going to launch this thing called the App Store. We want y'all to be the first to develop ideas for apps in the App Store. And for me, it was this wonderful way to say, whoa, technology can be accessible to an English major. And we can come up with new ideas. Yep. And so working with a small team there, and that really was the impetus for me going to work for Disney Parks. I was there right as they had invested $1 billion in overhauling all of their digital properties related to Disney Parks. So I was on the team that worked on, if anybody's going to Walt Disney World in the past 10 years, the RFID magic bands. I helped, running DisneyParks.com, eventually did a stint at Disneyland Paris, looking at their websites and digital experiences across 12 countries. But all of it was a great experience. A lot of that was, to point about teams, I was always in these small project teams. So thinking about, the Amazon 2 pizza rule, if you can feed the group with 2 pizzas, you're good. So generally somewhere between, 4 and 6 people on a project team is kind of that magic number. But I really relished taking on ambiguous projects. For Disneyland Paris, for example, I had no team, no budget, and I didn't speak the language. And I was like, put me in, coach, let's get on this plane, every 2 weeks back and forth from LA to Paris. So that was really formidable in my experience. And then from there, you get married, you have kids, you have my spouse is a career in tech. And so that took us to Portland, Oregon, and I transitioned to working for an enterprise software company in the product development and product marketing space, worked with a lot of personalities across sales and pitching to companies. And, you just sort of pick up a lot of those skills along the way. And then we moved to Chicago, had our second son. I went to work for a startup in the political tech space. So we were actually building building and selling software into nonprofits and foundations. And so that really solidified my broader understanding of smaller nonprofits all the way up to the largest of the large, like a St. Jude's or, American Cancer Society, and how there were many similarities in what I had done in the enterprise space and understanding, okay, well, a small nonprofit, like there are a lot of ways that a small nonprofit also looks like a startup or a small business. And similarly, you get to the level of a St. Jude's and they're operating, with a sizable budget and, thousands of people working in that organization. And a lot of the similarities I could see with just team dynamics, team development, processes and procedures, all of that were similar. And that was the first time I was exposed to that. And then I went over to work for Morningstar Financial Services. So unfortunately, the startup that I was working for ran out of funding.
Right.
Shut
It
down.
happens. Right. It happens though.
I've ridden that hockey stick growth and, didn't quite work out and having to pivot, and then got into Morningstar Financial Services. Again, my whole career has been about building. So entrepreneurship, building new businesses inside companies, building new teams, scaling those teams, running into something that's fairly ambiguous, giving it some structure, and then seeing where it can go. And constantly, to go back to the growth mindset piece, embracing that concept of testing, learning, and iterating and experimentation. And there is no failure, there's just learning. And so with that, scaled the global marketing team for the software division at Morningstar from 3 to 10 women, very rare, all women, all tech, all financial services tech on top of that. And that, my commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion really has manifested in how I develop teams, how I make sure people, when they're not physically in the room, how do I say their name, get them recognition for their work, and to think about the equal distribution of special projects. And when you're, sort of pushing someone to the forefront or giving them an opportunity to shine, that is really, really important to me. So spent about 3.5, almost 4 years at Morningstar, and learned a lot about financial services, tech, and the same team. I'm, with team development, it's not just the teams that report directly into you, but especially as you get into larger organizations, I was at the nexus of sort of management by influence. So you might be managing a team in marketing, but what's going on in sales? What does that relationship look like? And what does product relationship look like? And how are you speaking with your legal team or your finance team and other things? So that fluidity of building relationships and investing in those relationships, I think, has been really important, and something that I've strived to be, the best I possibly can be in everything that I've done. And then in the summer of 2020, I saw a tweet from my predecessor at Davidson in this role at the Hurt Hub. And she said that she was moving on and starting her own company. And I turned to my husband in the midst of the pandemic, before vaccines, and we had 2 small children. He was working for a tech company, so he could work from anywhere. And I said, so are we going to accelerate that retirement plan? We had always said we wanted to go to North Carolina. Anyway, so it was as I like to say, purposeful serendipity. You put things, you invest in things in the universe, and then the universe opens a window for you. So, and here I am 2 years later at the J. Hurt Hub.
It's fantastic. And thank you for sharing that story, because what a wonderful illustration, frankly, of the intersectionality of for-profit, nonprofit, the principles you have worked both sides of that fence. And I'm thinking about listeners that are kind of the emerging leader, just out of college, perhaps thinking about either direction, but you, of course, prove that you can go back and forth, right? And the principles will, in fact, apply. Before we talk more about those principles, though, for those listeners who don't know, what is the J. Hurt Hub?
Sure. The J. Hurt Hub at Davidson College is for innovation and entrepreneurship. So we like to say that we are the confluence of campus and community. So anybody that is looking for broader access and exposure to the main resources that you need to take an idea from concept to, fully fledged business. So we offer things like educational programming, mentorship, access to startup capital, a beautiful co-working space, and access to other sorts of resources, guides that will ultimately help you pursue, meet you where you're at, but also get you onto the next stage. So we work, again, like I said, both with our community. We've got about 165 members of the sort of town of Davidson, Mooresville, Huntersville, sort of northern Charlotte region, who are renting space from us, but also have access and participating in all that programming that I mentioned. And they represent about 130 different companies. And then we have about 2,000 students on Davidson's campus. Not all of them are, interested in starting a business, but we support all of those who have that spark of an idea and get them to the next level. Similarly, faculty and staff members. So we do have classes that are core to the curriculum of Davidson that are being taught here as well. So it's on any given day, you can run into a whole host of different people, ideas. It's like I said, it's that purposeful serendipity of the mixture of spices and different perspectives that makes this place very special.
Well, and I love that. And again, I think that's a concept we'll talk about, because organizations can create those special ingredients if they're sensitive, as you have been. And I can only imagine the energy you must get out of, working with students, entrepreneurs. What is that like? And of course, I'm going to ask you a follow-up question about how you stay organized. But talk about that special sauce you're creating every day, given those different audiences.
Yeah, but there's many layers to it, and so I'll start sort of more in the hyper local, and then grow up from there. So as I mentioned, the town of Davidson is quite small. It's about 13,000 people or so, and then another 2,000 students, and then roughly another 1,500 or so faculty and staff members that are supporting our institution here. I personally, on a very sort of tactical level, we employ students here at the HERT Hub as our community ambassadors. So they're getting the experience of working directly with our community, with those startup members. Similarly, we have a program called the Gig Hub, which is our high impact experiential learning program, wherein we're training students on particular skill sets, say social media marketing or data and analytics or translations, other things that they may naturally have or they're getting in the classroom, but also that we can augment with some educational programming around it. And then we broker the relationship with startups and small businesses in the community who are really looking to expand their capacity. And one thing that we're very proud of is that we have received both grant funding as well as philanthropic support for providing students with the grants to get paid for their work, but then we provide pro bono consulting hours for underrepresented founders in the community. And that program has just expanded quite broadly. So that's at the sort of everyday level. And then of course I also offer at what I call ask me anything hours, so like office hours effectively. So you never know when a student's going to drop in and ask you any sort of life questions. But then as a kind of slightly, as you blow that up a bit, the ecosystem is so important. And I know many on the call today, this hopefully will resonate with you. Think about your donors, your contributors, if you have corporate sponsorships going on, or if they're partner organizations to help you execute on your programming. That is so important to creating not just an entrepreneurial ecosystem, but this ecosystem of all the different nonprofit players in the area.
Exactly.
So we have partnerships with groups like Launch CLT, which houses all of our mentorship programs. So that's about 100 plus different mentors that are all across the county that at any one given time, we can direct our startups, entrepreneurs, and students to apply for mentorship. Innovate Charlotte's another really wonderful organization that I think were started off on the more programmatic side and now have elevated to be more of the convener and a source of funding for everyone in this ecosystem. And then most recently, I've joined the planning committee around a group called GWEN, Growing Women Entrepreneurs Network. So you see, you've got pockets of more maybe of a demographic specific group, or some that are more agnostic, or other groups that might have more of a thematic focus around fintech, for example, in our particular ecosystem. But it's really that the volume, the breadth and depth of all of these different organizations that makes all of us thrive. So I'm big on the collaboration. Like, we're not precious about any of this, right? And then, so it's important to have that in place.
Well, and of course, that's a wonderful principle for nonprofits, right? And increasingly, funders, if there's not other reasons, and there are, but among all the other reasons to collaborate is, in fact, funders want to see that amongst nonprofit. So you create literally a lab of collaboration in the work you do. Clearly, you anticipated my question that there are nonprofit ideas emerging in the students and others that you work with in the community. But let me ask you the question. So if I'm a listener, Liz, are you part of any kind of national networks of this type of programming? So if I'm listening from anywhere else in the US or frankly anywhere in the world, could I find a similar organization to yours?
Yeah, there are many. And for us, because we're associated with the college and part of Davidson, we do seek out partnerships across all the different universities, colleges, and other institutions of higher ed in the area. So like a UNC Charlotte, Johnson C. Smith, some of the community colleges in the area as well. So that's kind of one level. There's a USABE group that's all around sort of entrepreneurial educators. And there are other organizations like SCORE, for example, a nonprofit, and that's really focused on small businesses. So each has their different kind of flavor. I will say from a grant perspective, and I suspect many of your listeners are writing grants and applying for that. One great example is that, we partnered with Launch CLT and another group called First Turn Organizations to show that collaboration across our geographies and applied for an NC IDEA Foundation ecosystem grant.
Right.
And 100% because we could demonstrate the collective impact, that because of this partnership, we were able to reach more underrepresented founders, those who needed our assistance in terms of capacity building. I fully believe that collaboration and that we could articulate that was the reason why we were able to win that award. And I suspect other states, I came from Chicago. There's a wonderful group called 1871. I believe they're for profit, but a lot of different groups across there. P33 in Chicago. There are a number of different groups, obviously on the West Coast where I was before. So I'd start out. An easy place to start would be looking at institutions of higher ed, and then kind of maybe branching out from there if you're focused and looking at entrepreneurship specifically.
Love that, and perhaps we'll put in the show notes, Liz, with your advice. If there's some links to some of the association level organizations like SCORE, that would be a good one, because again, that's a great resource, I would think, for nonprofit leaders in any community. That certainly SCORE exists, or if they can find the equivalent to the HURT hub in their university community or whatever.
That's right.
One more follow-up before we get into your three pillars, and you have some wonderful pillars of leadership that we'll talk about. But let me ask you this, because I have this conversation with a lot of nonprofit leaders, just staying organized. And clearly you have a volume of activity and data coming at you every single day. I wonder if there are any particular rituals or routines you found simply to stay organized.
Yeah, this is definitely something, as you will hear, right, that I try to get better at every single day. But just in terms of managing my schedule, I'll give you an example. When I first came into the role, I was taking any meeting, talking to anybody. I was just trying to learn. And I think in the first 8 weeks, I might have talked to 150 people. I mean, it got to a point where you're just on Zoom back to back to back all day long.
Wow.
And even the shift to carving off 3 to 5 p.m. every single day for that Ask Me Anything hours eliminated hundreds of emails, probably back and forth, or if you use Calendly, all of the ping pong of, I can't make this time, can you make that time? It seems simple and very tactical, but that did save my inbox, I will say.
Great idea. And because you're right, we all get caught in that digital ping pong, don't we? And so you've used a calendar program, again, get tactical for a moment, that protects your calendar. And I guess certainly you don't regret that early stage. You talked to a ton of people and got a lot of great feedback. But now that you've leveled off a bit, I guess you're more strategic in your calendar in particular.
Yes. And I will say too, because of my background in software and technology development, I've been a practitioner of the Agile methodology for, going on 13 plus years now. So if anybody's interested in that, it's a way of project management, different things. So I try to think about my time on 2-week sprints or 2-week intervals as well. Doesn't always work out, but that's just helpful for me to say, okay, within these 2 weeks, I'm successful if, and sometimes it's a task list, or sometimes it's I need to think about this. One thing in particular, I can't remember if we had talked about this yet or not, but I had a self-imposed, what I called professional development design sprint. And that's honestly I marked off 2 weeks on my calendar, despite a hurricane and illness and other things trying to get in the way. But 2 weeks where I just devoted myself to reevaluating my leadership style. So it said, I've been running and managing teams, hiring people for 18 years. You get in that sort of pattern and you have things that work, and that's wonderful. But this was a way for me to be really intentional about stopping and only taking meetings that were related to that element of understanding team dynamics. What does high performance look like? How do you define that? And then reading articles and other things. And obviously I'm a bit privileged because I have access to an entire faculty in psychology and anthropology and sociology and others that I could go, have a coffee with and have their, 50 years of subject matter expertise on something, or speak to somebody like Bob McKillop, one of the winningest basketball coaches of all time and collegiate history, right? So I was a bit privileged in that way. But nonetheless, I will say in terms of management and rethinking your calendar, being really intentional about what's the overall goal for that 2-week sprint, whether it's something as maybe heady and deep as professional development, or it's I just got to write this grant application. And certainly that's very important, but there's, different ways. So that's been something helpful for me to have a way to manage the calendar in that way.
Well, you got the wheels turning, and I'm betting our listeners are too, in terms of the sprint methodology. I love that. The focus and the strategic kind of step back and evaluate your time. And of course, love that 2-week period that you devote literally to a professional development mindset. And you're saying basically you block anything else during that 2-week period that's not related to that kind of growth mindset. Is that fair?
Yeah. And, what was challenging for me was writing back to people who had asked for time on my calendar to say, we need to chat about XYZ project or something. And really being determined to say, hey, if it doesn't fall within the bounds of what I said were my goals for this design sprint, I will ask politely, of course.
Yeah, right.
Hey, would you mind if we rescheduled or move this, 2 weeks out? I'm dedicating. And I did find too, the more that I was vocal and articulated, and I shared this with my entire team, I said, I am dedicating these 2 weeks to this particular goal. If something is on fire, absolutely.
Yeah,
but
right.
But if it's not, and it doesn't fall within the bounds of this goal, then let's respectfully, move it out 2 weeks. And for the most part, everyone was like, cool, I got you, no problem. I'll be respectful of that. So
love it. Fascinated by it. It's akin to something we talk about in our mastermind program around kind of a personal retreat, which I guess is a more intensive, 2 or 3 day period that, frankly, I'm convinced many leaders and nonprofit leaders in particular never devote time to what you just described. So whether it's a 2-week endeavor or maybe it's a 2-day endeavor, again, good for you, because I'm sure that your whole career, I bet you look back and think those 2-week periods probably develop the next 2 years for you in some respects. Is that right?
Absolutely, if not more. And part of that period was not just self-reflection, but I also developed a survey that ended up being more extensive than I originally had anticipated, but a survey for my team, asking my team to respond to the same questions I was asking myself. So questions of, what's your personal mission statement? How do you define creativity? I've been thinking a lot about this idea of, seasonality, or even times of the day when you're at your maximum, efficiency is the wrong word, but sort of maximum creativity and openness to feedback or to working with a team, and more around work style preferences. So going back to your mastermind work, which I'm familiar with, that was so important to me to make sure that the textbook or some of the material that I was reading about was an in-depth look at my team, and then internalizing that and thinking about my own leadership style with everybody that I've got on the field, so to speak.
Right.
And how do I make sure that I'm thinking about, okay, if this person is perhaps more introverted and prefers to learn by reading something, having a day, and then coming back to me, or for example, I'm taking my team on a 2-day conference next week. I intentionally blocked off the Wednesday because I know I have certain people on my team who are very introverted and for whom those 2 days are going to be really challenging,
Right.
and they're not going to be up to their best work until they have that day to just sort of reset
Decompress, right?
and decompress.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic. And again, illustrative of your focus on team development, and because I think it's kind of bandied about in a vague way, but that is such a good specific example by being sensitive to your team and adjusting the calendar to relate to the individuals and their different styles of learning, their styles of engagement, and all that. That's wonderful. It is a wonderful segue to some of the principles that you lift up, and in fact, I think you're going to lift up 3 pillars, if you will, in terms of leadership. And again, I'm excited because I think you're going to help us break down how this might apply to a nonprofit leader listening. So what I'll do is the 3 that you shared: entrepreneurship, number 1, innovation, number 2, and then design thinking, number 3. So maybe, Liz, we could take them one by one, where you could tell us what it means, first of all, and then maybe some ideas for application. So entrepreneurship. All right. How do you define it? And then let's talk about maybe how that might be a principle nonprofit leaders could apply.
Sure. And there are a couple things that now my teams and former teams have emblazoned on pieces of wood and art in my office. So these are the kind of themes that run through.
Yeah.
One is empathy is currency, is a line that's going to go through all these different concepts.
Interesting. Yep.
Entrepreneurship, entrepreneurship for me doesn't necessarily mean nonprofit or for-profit. I think it can be both, but entrepreneurship, that idea is truly building a business or a program out of some new idea and all the sort of processes or frameworks or other things that go with it. But it is also a state of mind and this relates to innovation and design thinking as well, but to always be thinking about, how might I put 2 seemingly disparate things together, bringing them together and create something new, but that ultimately results in executing against that idea, bringing something new to market, whether it's in a for-profit capacity or nonprofit capacity.
Well, and again, you're right. I think that these terms sometimes are thrown around, like entrepreneurship. And as you said, there's a thread that ties all of these together. But so in the sense of entrepreneurship, how do we create, well, one, I guess we have to create kind of a culture that's open to that discussion, but are there any other ideas or advice you'd offer? How do we get that into the culture of our organization and our teams?
Yeah, it's about experimentation and the appreciation for and the willingness to fail and succeed. Right. And so as I said before, of there's, and I don't know if it's apocryphal, I'm not sure who said it, but there's winning and there's learning. A few years ago, I was at a conference in Chicago Ideas Week, and the 2 gentlemen who started Stanford's design school, and again, these are all related, got up there and talked about testing, learning, and iterating. And there's been throngs of books that have been written on this topic. But the way that manifests, or has, at least for me, is kind of going back to that 2-week sprint of, okay, what is the smallest idea that we have with the smallest audience, but ultimately that we could run some sort of quick experiment, and then there's data or whether it's numerical or it's anecdotal or what have you, type of data, such that we can see, was our original hypothesis correct? What did we observe? How might we need to change that? And so it is truly embodying the mindset of a scientist and going back to the scientific method. I wrote an article a long time ago about how, embracing your inner marketing scientist, but in general terms, and it is both art and science. But I do see that, how do we get into the sense of nothing's written in stone. I have a hypothesis. I have an idea. It's well informed by observations and, sort of a social awareness. But then ultimately, I'm okay with running whatever your lab experiment is, right? Or your observations and doing something, and then being intentional about employing things like retrospectives, getting the whole team together, identifying, okay, did we hit this goal? If we didn't hit the goal, why didn't we? And being open and honest about that in a way that, no one's getting in trouble, no one's performance is being knocked or what have you. I think in some areas, it's a little bit harder to experiment, maybe depending on what realm you're in. If you're dealing with matters of life and death, obviously you want to capture.
Can't play with that, right?
You can't really play with that. In what we do every day, we have a little bit more freedom to experiment and to try something new. But going back to that growth mindset, it's not a fixed, if you didn't hit the goal, you're a terrible person or you don't have the capability. It's just, well, your original hypothesis was incorrect. So that's the mindset shift, and innovation to, getting into that word, that's a big word that means everything to a lot of people, and it gets tossed around.
Right.
But I see that there's two different, or I guess there's a spectrum of innovation, right? There's a incremental innovation that also leads to that entrepreneurship, right? Of that just quick experiments. What's the kind of 1% better that you can get every day? And then there's step change type of innovation. We're going to the moon. Right. And I think sometimes groups will conflate the two, or especially if they're thinking about, well, we really want to get to a much different place and get to the moon. They don't get started trying those little types of innovations first with that end goal in mind. I think, a lot of people talk about start with the end in mind and kind of work backwards, but people get handicapped, or they're stalled out by, oh, well, we can't get to that perfection. We don't have these resources. We don't have enough money. We don't have enough people. Of anything, I think being in the sort of startup environment is, you got to be scrappy. Start somewhere.
And not be paralyzed by that, right? Or that perceived lack of resources or personnel. Right,
exactly. So kind of get started.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I love that. And of course, number one, I'm thinking about some artwork I need in my office. It's not winning or losing, it's winning or learning. And what a wonderful mantra for a leader of any organization, but nonprofit is obviously what you and I are talking about. Do you model this, right? Are you modeling this concept of we're not losing, we're learning? Because I have seen a lot of organizations that are of a fixed mindset, right? And you'll go to a board meeting and they're like, well, we tried that, it didn't work. Mm-hmm. Or the staff meeting, we tried that, it didn't work, which again is opposite what you're saying. In other words, all right, what do we learn from that, right? But is that how do you activate this entrepreneurship or innovation mindset? Is it kind of a regular part of the rhythm of your meetings as a team or teams you've been part of? Or, in other words, it strikes me that you don't just wait to once a year have a retreat and be creative. You're building it into, I'm guessing, your leadership team.
Yeah, there's a few different levels of it. So one, coming out of my experience in the tech space, I embrace the objectives and key results framework. So yes, I'll preempt, this isn't my final book recommendation, but measure what matters.
You give me a bonus book. That's okay.
Bonus book. Measure what matters. And I think it might be whatmatters.com. It gives a whole overview of what people refer to as OKRs, objectives and key results. That methodology or framework I really love, because the objectives are more maybe if you do a 3-year strategic planning cycle, one of ours, for example, is to become an integrated and integral part of the Davidson College experience. And within that, we have key results that are just like SMART goals. They're time bound, they're measurable, they're specific, they have an owner, all those things. We typically will put those together on a half-year basis, so half of our fiscal year, but then we review them every 6 weeks as a team, and then also within my one-on-ones that I have with my team on a weekly basis. So that's kind of the higher level
in motion.
Framework. Yeah, keeps it in motion. So you're not just at that year-end performance review or review when you're writing your annual report and you're like, oh, wait, what did we do? What was that? I
Yeah,
don't,
months ago now, right?
right?
Time
Yeah.
is gone.
That's a
But
cheat
6
code
weeks.
too. So
Six-
every 6 weeks. So you are, documenting those stories. You're getting the testimonials from people who have gone through your programming. You have your numbers. So it's a cheat code for your annual report. So you heard it here.
You're ready when the time comes, right? Because
Right.
of that rhythm.
Exactly.
Well, this
Um,
is fantastic. Well, let me jump to the third one.
sure.
Design. I would say design thinking is less familiar
Sure.
as I evaluate all three phrases. So, what is design thinking?
Yeah. So design thinking, again, popularized by the Stanford Design School, but basically talks about the identification of a problem and then understanding who has that problem, the audience that you intend to serve, then using empathy, as I mentioned, so doing interviews to really deeply understand and put the human at the center of anything. So one issue with entrepreneurship or with startups that I've seen in the past, you fall in love with the solution, not the problem that you're trying to solve.
Gotcha.
Right. And so with design thinking, you fall in love with the people you're trying to serve and the problems that they might have or the challenges that they might have. And then from there, you think about, okay, I've identified the problem through talking or listening primarily, but interviewing different people, then being able to articulate that in that sort of hypothesis statement that I was mentioning before. Then you think about, okay, how can I ideate rapidly and come up with people call this brain writing or brainstorming or other things. You got all the Post-its on the wall, all these
Right.
different ideas. But the idea is then, okay, I take that brainstorm and I go prototype. You might have heard of the MVP, minimum viable product, right?
Yes.
What is the smallest thing that I can do, going back to my point about being scrappy, that will still satiate that need or issue of the audience that I intend to serve, but with the smallest amount of time, people, dollar, resources invested. And then from that prototyping stage, then I'm going to go test that out in the wild with everybody. And then it just starts this sort of continuous cycle with, okay, great. What did I learn from that test? Oh, this worked. This didn't. Great. I'm going to put that back into my prototype and build and build and build and build and build on top of that. So as you can see, there's a string that layers on all of these. I will say to your earlier question too, because I don't think I fully answered it. The way that I roll this into my team and how we talk about things, at the end of every single weekly meeting, we talk about wins and learnings. And then in those sort of 6-week review cycles, and we just had our quarterly review, so this is fresh in my mind, we talk about what wins did we have first, because everybody likes to celebrate. What experiments did we run? What did we learn? And what are we going to do about it?
Love that. And you're very intentional about that language, aren't you? In literally
100%.
the agenda of the meeting. And you create that kind of vocabulary amongst your team, which I love. And I'm thinking too, Liz, about just the minimum viable product as an example. And if someone's thinking, well, that applies to the for-profit or tech world, I'm like, no, you could apply that absolutely we're trying to feed more of the hungry in our town, right? Or we're trying to teach more kids to read, or we're trying to get more people to attend our theater performance, right? Any nonprofit strategic objective could benefit from that way of thinking.
Yes, that's absolutely. And for us, from from a programmatic standpoint, that looks like, okay, maybe we're going to run a pilot of the program with 5 people. And then knowing we eventually want to get it to 25 people or 100 people or whatever it is. But that small group you can learn so much from, and you incorporate, maybe you bring in somebody from the outside or somebody from your advisory board to be a viewer or an observer of that process. So now you're getting somebody who maybe wasn't in the thick of it or in the weeds of that development of the pilot with you, but you're getting that great external advice and somewhat objective, opinion to inform that pilot and then take it to the next level.
Yeah, and what I love about that, and of course the pace you describe, because we are guilty sometimes, I would say, in higher ed, as well as just nonprofit in general, forming a task force or a 2-year committee. And what you're describing, we could do obviously much faster, right? We try it, we learn, we get feedback, and we adjust. Not literally pull somebody in for some 2-year engagement that we probably don't need that much time anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well, being really clear, and anybody who has a background in project management, but being really clear about roles and responsibilities up front. We use a thing called a team charter, just outlining all of that. And even for those who you might be bringing in from an advisory board or a member of the community to invite to participate in this process, you can really cycle through things quickly if everybody understands why they're at this meeting, what's the agenda,
Yes,
what
yes.
specific, questions they're being asked or homework to do or what have you. It can be done. We do it every day here.
Yeah,
So
you're
yeah,
evidence of that, and the success you've had is certainly evidence further. All right, Liz, I got some rapid fire, and we're on the home stretch
Sure.
here, but I have to ask you several other questions because this is fascinating to me. How does your mindset around these concepts, entrepreneurship, innovation, design, affect the recruitment of talent? In other words, given the importance of culture and team culture to you, how does it affect your hiring practices? And again, for a listener thinking, all right, I want to create a team like what Liz describes, how would you advise maybe, or how does it affect literally how you hire people?
Yeah. So as an English major, words always matter to me. And it starts with understanding what are you going to put in that job description. So one of the lines that we have in all of our job descriptions is that we have fun doing the impossible. It's a Walt Disney quotation, but
Interesting.
borrowed it.
Yeah.
And using the language, just like we were talking about, using the word experimentation, being very upfront and transparent about, you have to be comfortable with data and talking to people and reflecting on things. So that sets the upfront expectation with how those words are going to attract or maybe detract, certain people, right? So that you understand this is the cultural vernacular that we have. I also use a thing called the messaging map that I've learned how to use many, many years ago on the for-profit side, but we use it in our nonprofit too, such that it's a 2-pager document that says our, visions, values, mission statement, the tone that we use, the words that we use. And I frequently tell people, if you think about in Disney parlance, it's not a customer, it's a guest. It's not a boat, it's a ship. What are those words that really mean a lot to you? And then from an interviewing standpoint, I try to use best practices around elimination of bias. Obviously, everybody has their own unconscious bias, and those things are well documented. But I work with my team to develop the interview questions to make sure that they're aligned to what we have in the job description. And then while I'll do, a couple of phone screens or Zoom calls or that, I have everybody on the team participate in those interviews, but we ask the same questions of every single person that goes through our interview process.
Right.
So that we're not chit-chatting and, having, oh, you grew up in Michigan too? Oh, great. All that kind of stuff.
Right.
Inputs bias into the process. And then we use a judging criteria like rubric effectively. And everyone has the opportunity to individually score that applicant, put in a number. And then just like our pitch competitions, we have an open discussion around superpowers of this candidate and that. A lot of people talk about cultural fit, and I'm not sure where I heard this, but I like the term cultural add. So
interesting.
Where do we have gaps in our perspective on the, is it on diversity and inclusion side? Is it some other aspect of what we're doing such that this person has the superpower that we lack, that we want to bring them
add
into
value, right? Genuine value. Yeah.
Yeah. So those are some specific ways.
It's fantastic. And again, it's just thoughtful in terms of, and frankly, given the turnover in the nonprofit sector, I think talent acquisition is huge. Yeah. And the importance of bringing in someone who is a value add to your team. I love that language as well. I'm guessing, knowing what I've already learned about you, you also apply some of these principles into the ongoing evaluation of your team. Talk about how once you've got them there, and obviously you want to maintain this strong team culture. So I'm positive you're not just using a generic once a year HR evaluation model. No. How do you evaluate and build your team?
Yeah. So going back to the objectives and key results framework. So we have both at a team level what we're trying to achieve, but then I take on the process of onboarding a new member to the team very, very seriously.
Great.
A lot of other people talk about 30, 60, 90-day programs. I will have at the beginning of somebody starting with us on the team, I have a pretty extensive way of pulling the job description and the requirement or the roles and responsibilities into more of an evaluation framework. So I have that individual do their own assessment of, are you a learner, a practitioner, or a teacher? That's sort of a green, yellow, red, where are you on that? And then we sit down and review that together. And that really helps us collaborate on putting together a sort of personal set of OKRs to say, oh, okay, maybe one of the job responsibilities is public speaking, but you feel like maybe you're somewhere between a learner and practitioner. How can I, as your team coach and team lead, I seldom use the word manager. I really like the word coach.
Speaking of intentional use of language, right?
Use it, going back to the language.
Yeah.
To think about, okay, what are the ways that I can either look for training opportunities, or maybe, we agree that putting you out of your comfort zone, but with some support from me in this particular area of public speaking, how do we build up to you having the opportunity to go present to the faculty or present to a community or present on this program? And so it's pretty bespoke in the way I want it, that individual to have a personal self-reflection. And then we have a conversation about how do we build this development plan together. And I go back through after, that 30, 60, 90-day plan, every 6 weeks or so, I dedicate our regular weekly one-on-one time to going back through and reviewing those personal OKRs to say, oh, do you feel like you've gone to the next level? Where are we at? How do we adjust? It's always this fluidity, like I said, getting back to experimentation that really permeates that. And then I do a lot of walking meetings. I know people have talked about that historically. Yeah.
Why do you find it so helpful?
One, I have to move. I have a lot of kinetic energy.
Yes,
so that helps me. But the other thing, I read an article about this the other day, if you're having a somewhat challenging conversation, not having to sit across the table from somebody and being walking parallel next to them with your eyes forward, it brings that severity isn't too hard of a word, but it brings the uncomfortableness, down a bit. And then the movement too, you're breathing, your blood is moving through your body. It just kind of quells any challenging situations, or frankly too, it doesn't have to be a challenging conversation. It's just let's celebrate wellness and get out in this beautiful space and breathe some fresh air. There's nothing. And I always ask at the beginning of a 101, I said, oh, do you have something that we need to look at computers for, or can we take this as a walking meeting? And honestly, about 80 to 90% of the time, there's nothing to look at, or, we can walk it and talk it, or we looked at it ahead of time. So now we can have an open conversation. I've switched to just, more recently, probably over the last year or so. And it has really been a game changer.
It's fantastic. And again, I think you're absolutely right. There's something about that kind of when you're in the face-to-face, there's almost an antagonism sometimes that can occur if you're facing off in that stance. So get them out and get outside, or if weather permitting, right?
Yeah, right.
You can turn it into a practical and uplifting conversation. So Liz, this is fantastic. I've got questions I didn't get to, but we may have to talk about another episode because so much of this applies, I think, to the personal and team development of leadership in any setting, certainly in the nonprofit setting. But is there anything else? Again, I know you've captured so much, but for someone listening now thinking about nonprofit leadership, either getting into it or excelling where they are, any final advice you might offer?
It really starts with self-reflection. So if you have access to a coach, that's wonderful. But even I had a wonderful coach, and a couple of things I'll leave you with that she walked me through is one of getting back to that 2-week sprint. At the end of each day, writing down the 3 things that energized you and the 3 things that depleted you. And then and don't look at it until the end of that 2-week sprint. And then you can look at some of the themes that crossed out of there. And then as well, I did another exercise where it's sort of you in a Venn diagram, writing out, what do you think are your personal skills? What are your personal needs? Just from Maslow's hierarchy type of thing.
Right.
Where are the areas that you would really like to learn more about, whether it's about yourself or an industry or, a focus of a nonprofit or whatever that is. and seeing the intersections to help give you a little bit more of a map of where you need to go. And then the third thing that I'll say is I did this exercise every single year. I do ask for 360 feedback from anybody that I've worked pretty closely with on a project.
Right.
And in one year I did it. I just said, okay, just say the first 3 words that come to your mind about me. And I know that sounds like a little like, oh, just tell me how awesome I am, but
Right.
but what was fascinating again was the patterns, going back to my love of words,
Yes.
the patterns in the words and how others perceive you versus how you perceive yourself. I think that self-reflection is so important to being a great coach and a good leader.
Fantastic. Thank you for finishing what has already been a incredible set of advice and counsel and wisdom for our listeners. You certainly are an embodiment of the growth mindset that you talked about from the very beginning of this conversation. You've already given some bonus content in terms of reading recommendations, but you knew this was coming. Can I ask for one more parting gift, which is maybe a book that's been meaningful to you that you'd recommend to our listeners?
Absolutely. Culture Code by Daniel Coyle.
Okay. Why?
It's a study of many different types of teams, from Navy SEALs to pilots to creatives and everything in between, and really breaks down through very specific examples of why those teams perform in the way that they do, and thinking about the rituals, the language, the word, that true
Right.
culture, all the things that make up the culture of that team. He does such a great job of having very accessible examples and things that are also very inspiring.
Fantastic, Liz. Like everything else you shared, grateful for that. We will happily add it to the list of recommended books. And of course, I'm going to encourage our listeners to, for a lot of reasons, check out the show notes for this episode, because that and other resources you and I discussed will be there. In fact, Liz, where can people, listeners right now, go to find out more about you and the great work you're doing at the Hurt Hub?
Sure. It's www.hurthub.davidson.edu.
Fantastic. We will have it linked up in the show notes. And Liz, thank you again for joining me on the path.
I loved it. Thanks so much.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Liz as much as I did and came away with some practical ideas that can add entrepreneurship, innovation, and design thinking to your leadership toolkit and to your nonprofit organization. Don't forget about the show notes. They are available on our website, pattonmcdowell.com. You can find out more about Liz, more about the Hurt Hub at Davidson, and other specific resources she shared that might lead you to similar organizations in your community, wherever you are located. As always, please share this episode with just one other person on the path. And if you haven't already, you can subscribe to this podcast. Just go to the podcast page at pattonmcdowell.com and you will see the follow button. And that, of course, will allow you to follow this podcast on any of the primary podcast platforms. You won't miss out on any of our weekly episodes. They come out every Thursday. And of course, if you like this episode, click on the episodes button at the top of that same page, and you can scroll through thumbnails of some of our most popular episodes, as well as search by topic or guest name. Thanks again for all you're doing in the nonprofit sector, especially right now, and keep up the good work for causes that are most meaningful to you. I will keep bringing you content that can help you do it even better. Have a great week. I'll see you next time on The Path.